But they did have, from the very beginning, a really strong, fairly conservative sense of the importance of public schools and the importance to a community of its institutions, like old-fashioned, small-town public schools. And so when the Civil Rights era finally sort of caught up to their world, because they were having babies and going to college in the early parts of it, and I think we're fairly oblivious, like most white people, we're fairly oblivious to Martin Luther King and those events until the mid and the late 60s. But when it finally intruded into their world, really with that Supreme Court decision in 1969 that said our town had to integrate the schools, that was a sort of crystalline moment for them. And they realized that, not out of a kind of great social justice sensibility, but just a sense that this town needed to navigate that moment in time peacefully and successfully. And so they became involved in the effort to keep people in the public school system, to try to keep whites in the public school system. And as a result of that, there was some success at that. It didn't last. It lasted about 20 years, but if you go back to my hometown now, it is like almost every other place, and public schools are for black kids, and white kids go to private schools. So ultimately we failed in that effort. But they were committed to that, and they were committed to raising children who did not carry and deliver to their own children the burden of all those past perspectives. And so they were very supportive of all that. But at the same time, like I say, we failed. And America, in so many respects, failed at the ultimate goal of saving the public schools in that place. I mean, much good was done, so much good has been done. But we've all failed. Cleveland has failed in having a public school system that everybody can be a part of or is willing to be a part of. Atlanta has failed at that. Almost every major urban area in which you have a diverse population has failed at those fundamental things that should have happened. And so they were supportive of me and in those efforts, though a lot of things could have been done differently in those days, just as many things should be done differently now. But they were on the right side of things, and obviously I would probably be a very different person if that had not been the case.
Good afternoon. I'm DeAndre Jacobson from South High School. With all due respect, I would like to ask, please name some forms of slavery in the 21st century.
Well, in terms of forms of enslavement in the 21st century, it's fairly simple. It's in Georgia, for instance, in 1905. We'll pick a year, but in the state of Georgia in 1905. Oh, in the 21st. I'm sorry. I'm captured by a high school student. Foiled. Good job. Well done. Well played. Well, there certainly is enslavement in the 21st century. I would venture that for the most part, it's not in America. And I am often asked a question of, isn't this still happening today? Isn't all of this still continuing? Isn't the criminal justice system of today or the private prison complex, isn't that an extension of all of this? And those things are related. But I would say to you, and partly I'm protective of the victims of 1910, the victims who were in those work camps in 1905 in Georgia, because what they experienced was so horrifying, so terrible, so brutal and cruel and venal. It was so much so, perhaps the great amorality of modern American life that those events occurred. And so I'm always reluctant to equate much to that. I'm reluctant to equate bad things of today with those horrifying things of then. But that is not to say that there are not all kinds of terrible things that are happening today in America and elsewhere. I think slavery, true slavery, is still a very significant aspect of human life around the world. And we can, in Pakistan, there are brick factories that slave-worked brick factories that are identical in technology and labor practices to the brick factory on the outskirts of Atlanta that made the bricks in 1906 that are in my house, that my house was built with. And so those places that were endemic in the South 100 years ago are still endemic in parts of the world today, but not so much in America. And I think there's a more complicated question about that there are terrible abuses of laborers. And certainly we see with immigrant workers today, whatever one's view is about immigration, But certainly undocumented workers find themselves in coercive labor situations in America today that probably come the closest to some kind of slavery. But real slavery, buying and selling of people slavery, I would say that it's unlikely to find exactly that in America today, but it exists in the world. There's no doubt about that.
Thank you. Mr. Blackmon, your presentation was memories that were memorable. My question is related again to your memory. What was the role, when you were growing up, the role of black women? Thank you.
Sure. In terms of the role of black women in my life, I have a kind of cliched response to that almost every white Southerner of my age or older always has, and that is that there was a black woman who kind of raised me, or in my case, several of them, who came along at different times. But at different points in my childhood, when my parents were able to afford having help in the house, and if any of you have read the book, The Help, right now, there's something of a window into that, though my family was not nearly as affluent as the families that are depicted in that book. But there were black women in my home who, in a very maternal, domestic kind of role. And at church, there were no black members of my church, but the nursery of the church was run by black women always. And so I had a lot of contact with those kinds of African American women, but then I also had a huge amount of contact with professional African American women who were teachers, because in my schools about half the teachers were black and most of them were women. One or two men. And so they were a very, very vital part of my childhood experience, but two very different kinds of experiences. And those women were, those were black steel magnolias. They were extraordinary women. Interestingly enough, something that is forgotten today is that in those days, in almost all the hyper-racist southern areas like mine, in order to preserve the notion of separate but equal in the 50s and the 40s, like the state of Mississippi, you could pretend in my town that the white school over here, this nice, relatively modern brick building, well-equipped place, people were willing to pretend that was somehow equal to this broken down wooden building with no school books and not enough teachers, and people would participate in the fantasy that those things were equal. Everybody in America would go along with that fantasy. Everybody white would. But you couldn't even fantasize that somehow you were offering a law school to African Americans in Mississippi. And so the notion of you had to come up with, because the state of Mississippi was not going to create even a broken down law school for black students to create the separate but equal notion. So most of the southern states set up scholarship programs where if you were an African American college student, you could petition the state of Mississippi to send you to law school anywhere outside the South. And so huge numbers of African Americans went to school in Michigan and Ohio and Pennsylvania and got great degrees, advanced degrees, masters and PhDs, and at these terrific northern universities, and then went back home to be school teachers. And so one result of that was that typically the black school teachers were far better educated, far better credentialed than the white teachers. And my mother was one of those white teachers. And so those women were a very significant element in my life too.